Welcome back to the M&A Summit. Really pleased to have you with us for the closing keynote session, where we're going to have a fascinating discussion on using M&A to future-proof strategy. Really honored to have Roger Spitz here with us today. I first met Roger some time ago when he was leading the TMT investment banking practice in Silicon Valley for BNP Paribas, one of the largest investment banking firms in the world. Having spent 20 plus years in investment banking, Roger set off as one of the unique M&A futurists, studying innovation and disruption in organizations and looking at the ability to interpret signals and look at emerging change and disruption. And so we're so pleased to have an opportunity to bring together his experience in investment banking and deal making with his new work in a think tank environment looking at future-proofing corporate activity. So Roger, we're really honored to have you here for this closing keynote session. Would you take just a minute, though, and introduce yourself and introduce your firm?
Fantastic to be here, and thanks so much, William, and the Intralinks team for this phenomenal event. Just as a brief introduction, indeed, I spent 20 years on the M&A side, and fantastic time, fantastic organization, fantastic clients. And one trend I did notice, though, is that I became increasingly fascinated by the disruption over the past 4 or 5 years and how it impacted our clients. And more importantly, I felt that the filter of M&A was potentially more and more narrow from my perspective in terms of the, just following the more traditional strategic playbook. So I got deeply interested in understanding disruption, in understanding complexity thinking, in understanding foresight. And for the past few years, I've been kind of immersed in that with the view of spending more time and professionalizing it. And then I set up Tech Essential, which is technology and existential, because I believe, and this was even before COVID, that the speed and scale of disruption is such that you really have to navigate complexity and be able to thrive in it in a very different way from the more traditional playbooks, if I can call it that. So that's really what we do. We consult. I speak a lot. We have a governance practice which works on a number of things, and it's been I can tell you that the pandemic for Futurists is a very busy time, and it's been fantastic.
Well, Roger, we're the publisher of an M&A journal. We're the host of a series of M&A conferences and summits, but yet we don't always believe M&A is the right strategy. It may or may not be, but we're open to the idea that M&A may not be the key tool for corporate growth or inorganic growth. Before we get into the discussion today, let's sort of set the stage, and I want to introduce a polling capability so that we can ask this question not just of you, but we can ask it of the audience here. We have an enormous audience that is tuned in for this session, and so I'm delighted to ask everybody that's here to go ahead and weigh in on their comments and perspective on the importance of M&A, because I think it's interesting to set the stage on the outlook. Will it have the same importance in the future as it has in the recent past? So please go ahead and submit your thoughts. I'm going to ask Roger for his comments and thoughts on this question, which we're open to the answer being that it may not be as important. And then we'll take a look at the results of the collective wisdom from the poll as well. But Roger, what's your initial reaction to my premise?
Well, I personally think that it obviously plays an important role and will stay critical. But I think that a lot of the imagination and innovation which creates phenomenal companies doesn't necessarily come from M&A. And I personally found from my own experience over the past few years that, what keeps CEOs up at night, what the shareholders stress about, is less going to be around the sort of external inorganic growth strategy, but around a number of elements in terms of their positioning, who's coming out to eat their lunch out of nowhere, whether the industry will disappear, be completely reshaped, and a number of other factors that don't necessarily come from the transactions. That's not to say that it's not critical in terms of strategy. One thing while everybody's polling, which I'd be very interested in to see the results, I'll just sort of comment a little bit about some elements. And I think when you look at some of the very important industries, whether it's automotive, the OEMs, or food, the Tyson Foods of the world, payments industry, the First Data, space industry, whether it's, Airbus, Boeing, or even TMT. If you think about the telecom operators, none of these industries are currently today being reshaped and driven necessarily by the incumbents. And many of them are being driven by companies which didn't exist, 10, 15 years ago, some of which were actually created during the crisis. Having done TMT for pretty much, quite a long time, it's really the sector that surprises me the most because, Disney, it's only in 2007 that they took the control of BAMTech to be able to do streaming, which is, 2017 is not that long ago. Verizon bought Blue Jeans, which is a small competitor to Zoom, a few months ago, basically, when they realized that maybe streaming was potentially relevant. And Verizon, the Yahoos and all that. And so when you look at that, there's a kind of, on one end of the spectrum, a scrambling element. On the other end of the spectrum, a lot of companies coming out of nowhere, and which create entire industries, and then those become a nice hunting ground for some of the larger players. Whether it's the usual deals we see every day. So my answer would be maybe going forward less, personally.
Well, and I think we have perhaps a little subject bias in the population here, because certainly the even more important or the same importance was certainly the prevailing view. And obviously, as we're largely connecting with the M&A community here in a virtual fashion, we certainly hope that to be true. But I think it's interesting to open our eyes to innovation being another method in accelerating corporate growth. And certainly innovation-driven acquisitions has been the topic du jour for a lot of the folks in our community.
Yeah. No, without a doubt. And to be clear, I think M&A will remain a key strategic tool to help execute on the vision. And the fact that there's a lot of innovation through new companies that emerge, it also allows those to be acquired either by the large legacy players or even by, recent companies that have grown and that continue to be acquisitive. So no doubt about the strategic importance which M&A will remain. One of the examples I find very interesting is Intel when you look at future-proofing through M&A. And if you look at Andy Grove, for instance, very famous for the book and the many quotes, one of which is "Only the paranoid survive." It's a very interesting case study when it comes to M&A and future-proofing, because they almost missed the 2000 mobile shift. So, that they were under huge potential threat of, disappearing is a bit strong, but fragile. With everything that's happening around supply chains and China and trade wars and that, which are escalating, for the past 2-3 years, effectively China's now making the investment to become autonomous over time. So the Chinese chip demand will pretty much evaporate over time. And then the very interesting and important thing is the hyperscalers, their clients, the Googles of the world, basically something that used to be kind of commoditized and outsourced is now so critical in terms of IP and technology that they're developing their own in-house proprietary deep learning processes for AI. And realizing that, obviously a lot of the AI breakthroughs come from the hardware side when you're looking at the architectural design of the neural networks and the deep learning systems. So you have an important trend where someone like M&A, someone like Intel, however strong and mighty they might seem, if they weren't doing the right things, they would probably, be pretty vulnerable over time. And they, for instance, executed a pretty interesting M&A strategy. So I think the first big one, obviously, is Mobileye, a company which is fantastic and met a number of times in Jerusalem, and a spin-off from the universities. And effectively, that, in terms of value chain, is quite interesting because you have a chip supplier who's becoming more on the sort of equipment side and effectively on the autonomous driving systems. More recently, to our discussion earlier about the importance of the AI chips and AI edge, they acquired Habana. I actually invested in a competitor of theirs, another Israeli company. And then a few weeks back, everyone would have picked up the move towards mobility as a service, really to have the full stack of mobility as a provider, both big data, AI, but also the everything around the smart city and the self-driving demand driven by optimized driverless systems. And that is quite interesting, because if they hadn't done all that, and M&A was a good tool to help deliver on the strategy and the vision, they potentially would be missing a trick. And what is clear is that they're seeing the next stage of all this, which is computational intelligence and sentient tools, plus where you have the convergence of these exponential technologies, not just smart cities and autonomous systems, but of course 5G, Internet of Things, and industrial Internet of Things. And so M&A is critical, and it allowed Intel to stay ahead of the pack. I guess the distinction, and it doesn't really matter for the audience, whether you're working on a deal because of reason A or reason B, the chicken and egg doesn't matter as long as there's a deal often. But what's very interesting, I find, with Intel is that their secret sauce and their vision is really very deep in terms of innovation and anticipatory thinking. And M&A is just then an important tool to deliver on that. But just for those who may not be aware, and this is, in times like this is very noteworthy, they have actually had a partnership leadership team in place for 15 years on the basis that, separate from earthquakes or from tsunamis or other, of these events, it's something that was very likely to happen at some point, as everybody knows. It's just unfortunate no one bothered preparing or feuded. But B, from an Intel perspective, they established that if they didn't have a pandemic leadership team, in terms of the supply chain, if there was a pandemic, they would potentially be dead. They would not be able to potentially for years supply their customers, and they could disappear. So that's an interesting one. Obviously very innovative. Everybody knows Moore's law from Moore, the co-founder with Noyce, and Andy Grove, we quoted earlier, is obviously the number 3 employee there. So they're pretty much the built Silicon Valley, or actually the precursors to it. Foresight, they have in-house futurists who look 10, 15 years ahead, which is quite interesting as well. And they actually use science fiction for future casting for innovation. And that allows them to decode the next order implications. So that's why maybe I was a bit harsh on one or two companies in my introduction, but it's the difference between kind of scrambling and playing catch up on M&A for streaming or different industries, and the ones who are projecting themselves as to what the world could look like 15 years ahead or 10 years ahead.
Well, Roger, can I jump in here? Because this concept of future casting is very intriguing to me, but I got to tell you, I'm not sure if it feels as natural for some of us who grew up in Excel, who grew up doing discounted cash flows as a way to see the future in a pro forma financial statement. This is going to take us outside of our comfort zone. And, again, I not only do I want to ask some questions of you, but I want to also bring some polling in and encourage other participants to ask some questions about how, in practice, both organizations and their M&A advisors, which are on this call, are able to have those conversations and really bring this innovation layer into the M&A strategy that may work well beyond any accretive method of understanding an actual deal. Talk to us about how this works in practice.
Yeah, so listen, it's an area I like because it's to do with obviously innovation and disruption, and it's something, compared to many science fiction geeks who have were born in it. I actually discovered it quite recently in a corporate environment. So a little bit embarrassing to say compared to people who are kind of serious about science fiction, but it's evident the importance when it comes to a lot of technology and when it comes to a lot of some of the leading companies. I mean, you see it from the Elon Musks, Tesla, SpaceX. None of this is an accident. You see it across Silicon Valley, but even China and many other innovation hubs and leaders. It's not, an exclusivity to Silicon Valley. Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos, all of these, there's a huge driver. Just for the anecdote, Netflix's budget in terms of content is over 15 billion, of which a third of it is science fiction and fantasy. So it's, it's a driver in terms of that. And the last comment I would make, and this is not the purpose of this talk, although I've done other talks on this, which is quite interesting, is to look at really how much of the technology or ideas that were initially in science fiction became reality at some point. And that goes from the credit card to the smartwatches to a million things. Just to give you one number, from Minority Report in 2002, Alex McDowell, very famous, production designer, that actually influenced the future. There are over 100 patents from ideas that were floated in Minority Report that became, concrete, from driverless cars to wearable technologies to 3D, VR, biometrics. It's not to say that he created it or that it wouldn't have existed without him, but it's kind of, that anticipatory thinking and having innovation as a mindset. So I don't know if you want to sort of break on the results of the poll and that, but I'm
well, interesting that as I reflect on the poll results, about half of the respondents do think that trying to future cast corporate strategy, future cast customer behavior and demand drivers is actually an important and meaningful characteristic of our charter as M&A professionals. And, throughout the 3-day M&A summit, we've been talking about innovation and best practice and the techniques and methods. And I think some of that needs to be focused on innovation in our clients and our businesses' marketplaces, right? And so it's there's always been a layer of both advancing our knowledge and, frankly, advancing our careers that's been part of this M&A summit. And, I think you've excited us that one of our obligations is to start to think about future-proofing our M&A strategy, not just executing the deal, but thinking far beyond the transaction and thinking beyond the near term. And so I think you've expanded our lens a bit already.
Hopefully, possibly. But no, it's certainly a very interesting topic. And, what I wanted to spend time on now, because this is obviously one of the key M&A summits that exist, is to actually spend time on illustrating the point of science fiction and, the intersection with M&A, which is actually, there are many instances of this. So one example I quite like to use is when you look at Facebook. So they acquired a neural interface platform, Control Labs. Admittedly, at this stage, it's impulse armbands, but, it's pretty much the precursor in their mind to brain-computer interface. So they bought that. They also have Project Orion, which is a strategic partnership with Ray-Ban, which is owned by Luxottica, obviously, on the glasses. So that is effectively a strategy around smart glasses. And these smart glasses, they're dematerializing it, some of it through Oculus, which was also an M&A deal. So they're dematerializing the sensors, the controllers, and the smartphone itself. So ultimately, the idea is, you can use smart glasses, interact with augmented reality, stream videos, and take calls without that being tethered to your smartphone. And you can imagine that is just, so that kind of, if that happens, cuts out iPhones and, the phone itself. But interestingly, it also means if you have brain-computer interface or brain-computer communications, that you enter a world where you actually don't need the smart glasses either. Now that might seem very science fiction-ish, but if you look at the bottom Mojo Vision, the bottom example on the slide 11, they raised over $100 million of funding, and they've announced basically an augmented reality contact lens. So you can see that if you're starting to have, and this is announced, it's not something that they're kind of dreaming about. It may or may not work out and that. But you're looking at, therefore, not only getting rid of the dematerializing all the sensors and the batteries, but the smart glasses themselves. You have another example, which is quite interesting, which is Haptex, which raised a bit of money last year, which are gloves with actuators that inflate to give you the touch of VR. So it basically allows you, it's the first telerobotic system, which allows you to transmit touch feedback to an operator anywhere in the world. So you can effectively have touch through a VR system. And then, Niantic, which acquired 6D AI a few weeks back, which is, again, with the smartphone, allowing you to map virtual worlds, planet scale AR. So you're seeing, whether it's M&A or VC funding, you're seeing the intersection with some of these concepts of science fiction, maybe too close to Black Mirror. Israel has two very interesting startups, one called Arctops, which is, again, allowing you to map the multidimensional real-time brain activity. And another one called Core Actions, which is kind of non-invasive software that identifies the human intentions before something disastrous might happen. So, that is both scary and fascinating, but certainly science fiction-ish. So, to wrap up, maybe just quickly on the topic of science fiction, there are multiple examples of M&A. A lot of it is driven by M&A, but the important thing for me is really that, where do the lines stop between science fiction and science fact? You're seeing convergence between different digital technologies that are exponential, 5G, IoT, sensors, and all of that. You're seeing the deep learning, natural language processing, which allows you to basically no longer need a computer screen or whatever. You're just talking directly to your lens or what have you. You're looking at artificial and immersive reality, brain-computer interface. We looked at, with the haptics investment and human-machine interface, if you can start seeing, hearing, and feeling, and doing that in all, very small levels with nano-engineering and nano-manufacturing, touching upon space travel or digital teleportation. I call that DEIP, delocalized, experiential, immersive, and personalized. And it's a very interesting quote, in fact, by, Professor Kaku, who's, a very famous American theoretical physicist, futurist, who's a professor in theoretical physics, and who says, once confined to fantasy and science fiction, time travel is now simply an engineering problem. So one can look at this as a little bit geeky for those who aren't, tuned into science fiction. But actually, if you look at it from a corporate world and M&A and future proofing, it's actually not that alien.
Roger, can I jump in? I just saw a pretty interesting question come in, and I'd encourage other participants to share questions and observations as well. But I think it'd be a good time to inject this question in that, looking at the difference between M&A and venture investing is a tension, especially if future proofing is the ambition. In fact, forming and operating a CVC is a topic that we're going to look at through our M&A conference series through the balance of the year. Can you talk about how, the best practice looks in terms of that, balance between full control acquisitions and a CVC or minority investment position?
Yeah, listen, I'm glad you interjected it. I mean, it's a highly relevant question for what we're discussing. I think there's no doubt that if they're structured correctly and with the right teams and with the right interactions between the LPs and the fund and the parent, if you can call it that, CVCs obviously have an important purpose, including for some of the things we talked about. In fact, most of you will know Intel Capital didn't wait for the 90s or the early 2000s to start looking at investing like that. So it's an important theme. The one thing I would say, though, is that it has although it's meant to be aligned with a parent and it's very helpful for many things, there has been a lot of instances where people are just going through a checklist in terms of, we have the CVC, we're on the board, we have a ticket, but how well is that really integrated in the vision? And how well is that really, leveraged on? And how much control do you have over then how to develop those technologies going forward? So I would say it's never going to be a substitute. If we take, again, the Intel example, M&A is just the execution in the same way the CVC can be giving you access to certain interesting ideas and teams and technologies. But ultimately, they're just a tool to execute. You need to have the vision. You need to have the anticipatory thinking. You need to see how the world is going. And part of the toolbox will be M&A and part of the toolbox will be CVCs. But it's much more than that. And there's a little bit of a danger of tick the box, I think, in particular on the CVC front over the past few years. I wanted to give another example on different industries where M&A is very important. It may not yet be science fiction, but it's certainly very important in terms of future proofing. If you look at the future of retail, it's anything but retail, right? Between the direct-to-consumer models, the personalization, everything that happens with the predictive and the analytics, not to mention the immediacy, the immediacy of the checkouts or the production, the 3D production, etc. So you have a number of dynamics in retail, which is a tough sector, but where literally it is literally more than future-proofing, it's survival for those who manage to survive the industry. But they will be survived by those who really understand how to use M&A, amongst other things. And there's a very interesting battleground which is taking place, which I want to spend a minute or two on, which is around everything around NLP, natural language processing, and in particular with machine learning and digital voice, assistance, shopping. When you look at the AI uses for retailers, today machine learning is the most important one, a bit of chatbots. But the one that's actually the most critical and important is, as I mentioned, the natural language generation. And that's because you're looking at a battle between Google and Amazon. As computers and devices dematerialize, effectively what looks like a clunky Alexa today will be the future, in fact. So you won't be necessarily using a keyboard or, the same devices for the searches. That's why, obviously, Apple bought, one of these businesses a few weeks ago. And that's why, Amazon is spending a lot, because ultimately Amazon want to make sure that you're doing your searches and that you're speaking to Alexa and not to Siri or not to Google Home, because that's where you'll be also doing your shopping and your ordering. And so that battleground on NLP is a very interesting one, which is taking place. A lot of the startups are Israeli from that. I think Dynamic Yield is Israeli, probably Aspectiva, which Walmart bought, and a few others. So that's one of the aspects where M&A is very important. The second area in retail is around the physical. So, for the incumbents, and whether it's L'Oreal, Walmart, IKEA, they've all relatively recently made key acquisitions to help with the simulation, visualization, and especially the data in the end. So L'Oreal acquired Modiface, which is quite an interesting company, where it allows you to try on, and for many people probably try these in Sephora and elsewhere, but it allows you to try on cosmetic products, this real-time 3D facial recognition, and then facial tracking and rendering in terms of trying on the products and how they come out. So that's quite an interesting feature. Today you're going to Sephora for that. Of course, tomorrow you'll be doing it through WeChat in Asia or whatever in the Western world. But what's interesting is that this is, in a way, the larger companies trying to keep their leadership positions and do well or survive. But it's also the case for some of the smaller companies. So Trax is one of the world leaders in digitizing the physical world of retail. It's a relatively small young company in computer vision and analytics. And they made 4 acquisitions pretty recently. One was Copious to, an AI-based in-store tech, some around image recognition, some are around the things we talked about earlier, the search, the analytics. And so what's interesting is that this is an industry which is completely reshaping. It will survive, but it just may not survive in the current configuration. And you're having both, emerging players coming out of nowhere, but themselves who use M&A as a tool to future-proof, because it's not because you're a startup that you're future-proofed. Startups disappear every day or get, or lose their leadership. And likewise, the larger companies. So you can see kind of a convergence. Just as an anecdote, actually, it's quite interesting, Walmart, which I mentioned here with some of the acquisitions, because they obviously bought for $3 billion the Jet business, right, to move into e-commerce a few years back, which they just announced that they kind of disassembled it because they felt they couldn't integrate it and it wasn't helping them with their e-commerce strategy. So it's not so simple, M&A, as to just assume that because you're buying the right kind of thing standalone, that it will obviously transform your business. And of course, everybody around the table, you're all very savvy and you're mindful of that. But it's a good reminder. When I saw, Jet to try and catch up with Amazon a few years back, spend $3 billion on Jet, and then you see a few weeks ago that effectively they've wound it down and written it off. It's telling.
Well, Roger, I'd love to interject here, and as we talk about innovation in both in the spirit of R&D, but also in the practice of M&A. one of the issues that we talked about in day one of this M&A summit was artificial intelligence and whether AI was going to enable new and better practices and processes in M&A. In particular, we had an interesting interview both with Intralinks and with Knowable talking about the use of AI to analyze documents, customer contracts, and not just M&A documents, but your company A is acquiring company B. Company B has tens of thousands of customer contracts, and will those contracts be assignable to the new owner if the business is sold? So, we started with a very pragmatic and very simplistic look at AI in the process of M&A. I suspect you could help us bring a much wider view and lens to this issue. And let's also bring in the next polling question too, as Roger and I talk about this. But is there a role for AI in M&A?
Yeah, so I think AI is one of those where the choice is for humanity, I think, as to whether we'll be eaten by AI or whether we'll use AI as an augmentation. And I'll walk you through the thinking on why I'm saying that. But I actually think that we have a choice as to what will happen and to whether, as I say, will be substituted or not. But maybe just looking at that debate, and thanks for interjecting that, William. There's an original Anderson guys with the software is eating the world, and hundreds of examples of that. We're moving to now software eating software, where a lot of the companies are on no code or low code. You're looking at Wix and all these companies. Microsoft just did a deal. They acquired AppSheet, where effectively you no longer need coding. And so in a way, it's software eating software, many examples of that. And then to the debate of AI, being eating humans, we'll have a look at whether that takes place or not. There are quite a few interesting deals on the sort of software eating software. Visa's acquisition of Plaid, for instance. They had the plumbing for a lot of the connection. Everybody knows what Visa does. But effectively, Plaid allows the connection with the fintech apps. So with open banking, where you're looking at basically the banking APIs, and you're looking at using the software apps and almost as a platform in the same way as AWS is doing with hosting and web services, fintech is doing that as a platform through software. And one of the companies that raised $35 million, Phoenix, which is a very interesting company. It's a software company that allows you to do payments. And I mean, we know that you can do payments through WhatsApp and all these things. They've just launched their payment service in Brazil earlier this week. But you have Phoenix, which effectively is saying, you don't need any more the payment processors. You don't need any more all of that kind of plumbing because you can pay directly as a software company. So that's an interesting case of that. But just to kind of wrap up the session, what I'd like to do is spend a minute around the question you asked, William, which is how is AI being used and where is it going? And the way I like to look at it is almost like a decision-making value chain, which is, you detect and you collect intelligence, you analyze that, you then interpret, pattern recognition, you'd interpret the data, and the algorithms are pretty good at that. And then there's a prescriptive bit, which for now we've kind of thought, well, M&A, for instance, is too noble. It's quite complicated. You're in complicated systems, so you need that experience, that judgment. And so the question is, indeed, as you move from optimization or automation to augmentation, where you train the data, to maybe more even scientific discovery or drug discovery or drafting contracts, as you said, you're moving more towards hyper-augmentation and creativity. And the question is whether AI is moving and how good AI is in the complex systems. So when you look at, for instance, drug discovery, and I know it's a few years ago and Google may have managed this even without acquiring DeepMind, but some of the drug discoveries when COVID first started becoming a global pandemic a few months back, it's DeepMind's machine learning that predicted the viral protein structures quite early. Dassault Systèmes, their largest deal ever, Medidata, is to automate and streamline the clinical development. But clinical development is not data-driven today, but they're looking at the future of trials. They look at the next generation clinical trials, which might be driven by data or algorithms. And then, of course, you have some of the large, fundraisings, Excentia, Benevolent AI on the drug discovery front. And these are all AI companies. Now, closer to home, I do want to spend a minute on the own profession of much of the participants and everyone around the table here today, which is M&A. You have a company called Axial, which claims that it's the Tinder for M&A, not their wording. I think Bloomberg or one of the news, picked up on that kind of label. But they consider that they've connected 2 million deals and over 2 million potential deals, 2,000 transactions, and $25 billion of deal value. Angel AI has a machine learning system which matches companies to the best suitors to intermediate between VCs and startups. And most interesting, actually, maybe some of you have picked this up a few days ago, it's EQT who has a machine learning platform called Motherbrain, which they consider drove more than 100 million of portfolio company investments by their VC EQT ventures driven by AI. In other words, Motherbrain monitors 10 million companies. They take data from dozens of structured and unstructured sources to identify possible investments for EQT, and allegedly 100 million of their investments from EQT Ventures were driven from those algorithms. So this is at the it's disintermediation for sure, and it's starting to encroach in that area. It sounds like you guys covered what I'm going to mention now earlier this week. Shame I missed that session. I'll pick it up on the replay, but everybody knows indeed the speed with which software is basically going through due diligence. In 2017, I think JP mentioned that their software, it took them seconds to do what used to take lawyers 360,000 hours. In 2019, it started to become that the due diligence was also automating the creative process. In other words, you were finding some of the drafting and the writing and the legal work being proposed. And then coming back to our topic, DocuSign announced earlier this year the acquisition of Seal Software, which allows them to provide, critical clauses, compare them side by side, identify the risk, the opportunity, the negotiation tactics to come up with actionable insights that then drive the negotiation. So you can see that the line is quite thin between, what's predictive versus what's prescriptive, and how much is is it just augmentation or is it substitution for some of these positions in the value chain? So that brings me to just as we wrap up, looking at what is complicated and what are human decisions. And one of the elements around human decisions is that humans have kinesthetic intelligence, which doesn't require the temporal lobe. So that's for timing and sensors, as well as emotional intelligence. Although many of you will know that there are some interesting startups around emotion AI and affective computing, one of which is called Affectiva, which recognizes, interprets, simulates, and reacts to human emotion. And the real question is, how good are we at navigating complexity? And how good is AI at navigating complexity? And just in the interest of time, the big distinction between complicated and complex is that complicated, which you see on the top right of the screen, is that you can analyze cause and effect. You can rely on experts. There's a range of right answers. There are known unknowns. And AI is pretty good there. Complex, it's unknown unknowns. There are no right answers. You're hoping to, test a number of things and be innovative to have emergent practices. And it's only retrospectively that you can, assess the cause and effect. And the point here is that I personally don't think that humans have done a phenomenal job, and we've seen it quite recently in the complex quadrant. And I believe that we are now today, we've been in that quadrant to my mind for some time, but it's accelerated. We'll be in complex more than complicated for some time. And so AI is not either that good today in the complex. They might come up with, pattern recognition and a number of things, but it might be spurious in terms of, what's the cause and what's the effect in terms of actually being good at that. But the real question for me as a closing comment is really we need to upgrade ourselves. I think AI is moving pretty fast and is learning fast around the value chain. And what I put as AGI is artificial general intelligence, which is, the machine's pretty much reaching all the capabilities of humans, if not more. And I have no idea whether that can happen and what the time frame is that, the people like Ray Kurzweil and others who have, enjoy predicting that. But what I would say is that machines are learning fast and moving up that value chain. And I'm not sure today, collectively and individually, how good we're trained at being anticipatory, how good we're trained at being the opposite of fragile, to use Taleb's terms, anti-fragile, how adaptive we are. And so the real question for me, and this is, the closing comment, is we're in a transition today, which is the middle column, which is we have decision-making, which is augmented. We have AI, which is quite good in some autonomous domains. We use data in a way which is providing insights, but often it's, humans and experts which call the shots, and it's a predictive world. Could we fall from what I call the C-suite to the A-suite, where A might be an algorithm or AI, where effectively, if we don't follow what I kind of label AAA, you end up with your CEO being algorithms, or the world becomes so complex that we have trouble and we're worried about, the liability and the wrong judgment of making the wrong choices in this complex world. And so today we're at the frontier, I think, where neither AI nor humans are that good with complex. AI is learning pretty fast, and I think we need to make sure we understand what the world tomorrow is, and it's not driven by knowledge-based linear education systems or the way a lot of the leaders and governments are kind of trained and run on that. So that's my view on the topic anyway, for what it's worth.
Well, Roger, fascinating comments, and thank you for sharing your perspective. And I know it's been grounded in experience as such an active M&A advisor, and really shaped in part, I think, through your proximity to the hub of innovation in Silicon Valley. And you've really, I think, taken us out of our comfort zone. You've taken us out of the detailed look at deal structuring and closing mechanisms, and moved our thought beyond, working capital adjustments to thinking about future-proofing M&A. Can I ask you to comment as well? I think you're often helped us think about our representation of the organizations, either that we work for or that we advise, and how we future-proof the companies and their strategies that may or may not involve M&A. But can we spend another minute on future-proofing our careers? And, a lot of us have, of course, an obligation to keep advancing our expertise and our experience. What are some of the things that we can do as a profession to continue to future-proof ourselves?
Yeah, well, I think it's really to do with, it's a bit cliche and apologies, but it's learning, unlearning, and relearning. And it's really just continuing to challenge oneself. I think that personally for me, a phenomenal tool has been actually foresight and future thinking. I know it's not well understood and people think it's to do with predictions, which it's not. And that, but I actually think foresight is a very important tool. I actually think it should be taught at school. I think one should think about the schooling system and where you send your school, your children, and what they're learning, and do the same for oneself. And the most important piece of I would say is we're often looking at automation when we're looking at substitution. So we're thinking, maybe we'll be automated. I have to do this better or differently, or one doesn't necessarily realize that it's not automation that we're talking about. It's transformation. It's so you take a lawyer, for instance, people will think, well, lawyer's quite complicated. I don't really see an algorithm doing advocacy as a barrister in Gray's Inn in London. But the point is that they're looking at the process of advocacy today and law today. What they're not thinking about is 5 or 10 years' time, you may end up with the same outcomes of coming up with a judgment in terms of whether something is legal or not, but not the same process. And people have trouble imagining that because they're assuming that there's a linear world where the future is similar to the past. But we're in an exponential world, and we have trouble grasping what exponential is. And that's one of the things that foresight teaches you, is these parallel universes are not science fiction. They're they're decoding signals that are early. They're trying to look at what might be alternative futures that could pan out. These are plausible futures. It's not science fiction. And within that, trying to understand with the agency we have, what does that plausible future mean that's the preferred one? And how do I get to that? And understanding the impact, not just technology, but technology will be a key driver in the 2020s of the convergence and exponential technologies. And the meaning of exponential is really the crux of it. And so I've mentioned a lot of things there, but hopefully they're pieces that are relevant. I'm trying myself. I'm launching a new institute in a few weeks' time, and we'll be spending more time on the education side to try and give people tools to think about these things, guidance and practical things. So hopefully we'll stay in touch with everyone and people can follow that and get a lot of pointers.
Well, you've given me a nice segue because I wanted to ask the last and final question is you've given us a call to action, but how do we learn more? What's the best next step? Can we go to Tech Essentials website? Is that the best next step to learn more?
Yeah, I think there's a newsletter there. I have Twitter. I haven't been as proactive as I could have because I've been, this has been extremely busy the past few months, but I'm reorganizing with a dedicated practice, which will be called Disruptive Futures Institute, and which will be much more better packaged around the content. So I think for now, to keep it simple, if you're connected to me on LinkedIn and sign up for the newsletter on Tech Essential website, you'll be up to date.
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you for the invitation to continue to engage. And certainly, your contribution has been terrific and really helped us as a closing keynote look to the future. And we've got a big community here that, with the support of Intralinks, has gotten together virtually to share ideas, to share best practices, to have some camaraderie. We're all navigating through this deal environment together. And so we're certainly appreciative of your contribution and perspective. And obviously grateful for the support that Intralinks has provided to bring us all together. So thank you for your comments. With that, we've closed out this beautiful 3-day M&A summit. Thanks everyone for your participation, and we look forward to continue to stay connected both virtually and in other ways in the future. So thanks again, Roger, and thanks for joining us, everybody.
My pleasure. Thanks, William. Thanks, Intralinks. Bless everyone.